Hello, and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Melissa Griffith, and I'm a Senior Program Associate with the Science and Technology Innovation Program, also known as STIP. I will be moderating today's session. STIP analyzes and translates how emerging technology will impact international relations and offers policymakers and the public the necessary tools to understand advancements in science and technology, including through citizen science, serious games, and a wide variety of training programs. 5G, the topic of today's discussion, is the critical infrastructure of the future, and increasingly, the critical infrastructure of today. The fifth generation of mobile network technology will be essential to how industries compete and innovate and generate value, how people communicate and interact locally and globally, and how states pursue security for their citizenry. In particular, one segment of 5G networks has increasingly found itself at the forefront of both policy and industry discussions in the United States, in Europe, and around the world: the radio access network, or RAN. In its simplest form, a mobile network is comprised of the core network, the radio access network, and transport or backhaul between the two, and then end user devices such as sensors or smartphones. Of all of these segments, the RAN is the least vendor diverse segment of the network stack. In fact, today there are only a handful of vendors, namely the likes of Sweden's Ericsson, Finland's Nokia, China's Huawei, and South Korea's Samsung, that can offer an integrated end-to-end network at scale. This is where Open RAN, the topic of today's discussion, an idea which is championed by consortiums such as the O-RAN Alliance and the Open RAN Policy Coalition, has entered the public and policy conversation. I must admit, rarely do technical standards capture the public imagination, yet open radio access network architectures have increasingly done so. Open RAN, in its most basic form, creates standardized and interoperable interfaces, colloquially known as open interfaces, between systems in the radio access network. Unlike traditional telecommunication networks, which are either proprietary or optimized by the individual vendor, and in which software is often tied to the underlying hardware layer, open interfaces make it possible for a telecom operator to shop around or mix and match between various vendors. Opening interfaces will encourage a greater number of players at each level of the network. This is possible because now companies can specialize in subcomponents. They do not have to build out end-to-end solutions. Moreover, through open interfaces, Open RAN proponents hope to see a diversity of vendors emerge. This will simultaneously alleviate economic and national security concerns that have arisen and continue to arise from a monoculture of vendors in general and the prominence of Chinese vendors in particular. Today, with the Wilson Center's Global Europe program, and in partnership with the Embassy of the Republic of Poland in Washington, D.C., we aim to go beyond the buzzwords. We will offer a closer look at the evolution of Open RAN, open 5G network architectures across the transatlantic community. This will include a discussion of the state of play around deployment, some conversations around persisting challenges related to Open RAN, and end with some discussion of policy solutions. Following that moderated discussion, we'll pivot to audience questions. Many of you have provided those questions in advance through the RSVP page, but as you listen to today's moderated discussion, I am sure inspiration will strike, so please do submit additional questions. You can email those questions to us at stip, S-T-I-P, @wilsoncenter.org, or tweet them at us at WilsonStip. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to briefly introduce to you our four panelists. Joining us today, we have Dr. Sławomir Pirczek, CEO and founder of IS Wireless, Mr. Stein Lundby, Senior Director of Technology Strategy for Qualcomm, Mr. Franz Seiser, Vice President of the Access Disaggregation for Deutsche Telekom, and Mr. Sami El-Haj, Senior Advisor for McKinsey & Madison Dearborn Partners, and formerly the President of Nokia's mobile network business. Together, our panelists bring to bear expertise and experience from across the US and Europe. They hail from multiple time zones, some joining us bright and early on the West Coast and many others in the late afternoon, early evening in Europe. And they can offer us insights into Open RAN from the perspective of both vendors and operators alike. Thank you to all four of our panelists for joining us here today. I would like to start off our discussion centering on the state of play. Where do we stand in the United States and Europe in terms of deployment? As hinted at in our panel description, the answer to this question is multifaceted. There is growing interest and, of course, increasing rhetoric around Open RAN on both sides of the Atlantic. Increasingly, operators are starting to test, validate, and deploy Open RAN technologies in the field. And we even have major radio access network vendors adding Open RAN solutions to their portfolios. It is clear there's momentum here, but we have to admit at times there's also a lot of hype. This can make it difficult for interested parties to assess what progress we've made toward leveraging Open RAN equipment within our 5G networks and how far we have yet to go. With this in mind, I'm going to ask each of our 4 panelists to offer us a peek behind the curtain. First, let us turn to 2 different vendors in this space, both of whom are part of the growing Open RAN ecosystem. Stein, let's start with you. From your vantage at Qualcomm, where do we stand in terms of deployment? And what are the differences and similarities that you see between the US and Europe?
So there have been some small deployments, surprisingly enough, in brownfield first. Telecom Italia was one of the first companies who deployed, maybe 5 years now ago, on the outskirts of Turin, a 27-cell system. And as far as I know, it's still operating commercially, and there's never been any big issue. We've also had some systems deployed in Alaska, where a local operator did a pretty large deployment at the time, also brownfield. And in Mexico City, where Telcel Mexico densified Mexico City, the streets, with an Open RAN solution, which actually we were involved, our experts of deployment team was involved in helping to make sure that that works fine and deploy it. Since then, the big deployment, a larger scale, has been Rakuten, and they've really been a pioneer. And they've not just been taking a little bit of the open concept, they've been going all out, RAN core, bringing in all kinds of new vendors, small startups from India that you had never heard of before, some from big companies like Nokia from Europe, Cisco from the US, put it all together. And yes, it's been a challenge, and we've participated there. We've been supplying a lot of components there and expertise. We have a team of experts that's been supporting them and making sure the network works well. But they've done it. They've done a nationwide system on 4G and 5G in an absolutely record time. Were there some challenges? Were there some speed bumps? Yes, there were, but there's nothing as a showstopper, and they overcame that. The next big one is Dish, and Dish is a new entrant in the United States. And just like any new entrant, the question is, do you do a copycat, do exactly the same thing as the existing 3 players that are entrenched, or do you try and do something differentiated? And they've announced that they've gone with the Open RAN, with VMware, with Altiostar, Mavenir, and with some bigger players, including leveraging the cloud players. I think it's Amazon that they're using for the cloud, if I remember correctly. As far as I know, that's working very well. It's not as yet commercial. And then finally, the next big one that's been announced is in Germany, Drillisch 1&1, which is a new operator deploying there. There've been meanwhile, some smaller systems, such as Vodafone has been deploying, I believe, in Turkey and to a certain point in the United Kingdom. And then probably Deutsche Telekom can tell us, they probably have some smaller deployments and tests. But those are the big ones we've been involved in, and the big ones we've been supplying to at a pretty big scale, because it comprises quite a few small cells, and that's what we've been supplying: chips to small cells, also test equipment, and we've also been supplying expertise.
Thank you. I think you point out that this is sort of a patchwork ecosystem, but it's not just theoretical anymore. We're actually seeing it be deployed in practice. I will ask you before I move on to Slawomir, though, you used 2 terms there, brownfield versus greenfield deployment. Can you define the difference for those of our listeners that are thinking brown, green? Is it environmentally friendly? What's the difference between those 2?
You're quite right. So brownfield refers to the fact that you already have a network with 4G, maybe even 3G and 2G, and you're adding some new equipment into it. It's a pretty different problem that originally was one of the criticisms of, or not people were saying Open RAN won't work there because of new vendors is how do you integrate someone else's equipment? If you already had a Nokia network, like say, let's say 3G and a 4G Nokia network, and you're bringing in Nokia to deploy 5G or expand your 4G coverage, it's probably going to be okay because it's the same people, right? And the same systems, and they know it. But if you've got a Nokia network and you're bringing in some, like an Altiostar, a Mavenir with Cisco, or an IS Wireless with Benetel from the UK, you're kind of more nervous. And are they going to be able to make these two different vendor systems work together? So brownfield is when it's a mix of different vendors. So there's already something in place and you're adding something new. Greenfield is you're coming in and there is nothing already. So Dish and 1&1 Drillisch in Germany are greenfields because they had no pre-existing equipment. And so is Rakuten also.
Perfect, thank you. A little bit of a pop quiz there right at the start of the panel for Stein. So I want to turn now to Sławomir. As the CEO and president of a Polish vendor operating in this space, what is your assessment of the state of play? Where do we stand in the US and Europe?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the invitation. Well, from the technical point of view, I would say that the current deployments on both sides of the Atlantic, they have very much in common and they don't differ much. So first of all, they all follow the principle of software hardware disaggregation that we also call virtualization, and that is good. Then if you look into how the software is built, then unfortunately this software is quite monolithic. It looks like the solution was based on someone's 4G upgrade, and it's not really prepared for 5G. It's not really prepared for further level of disaggregation of that software. Then primarily those deployments are macro networks. So we are not really talking here about very high spectral efficiency, aerial spectral efficiency, so bits per second per hertz per square meter. And this all looks like a virtualized 4G design, and that is what we call Open RAN Wave 1. The first step towards this is based on an upgrade of 4G solutions, and it's not enough. I mean, that's what we see right now, but solutions that we are observing right now, they've been developed over the last 5 to 6, I would say even maybe 10 years, if you look at the history of those early providers of Open RAN. And with the famous hockey star saying, Wayne Gretzky, that is, he said, I skate to where the puck is going, not where it has been. We think that it's really not enough, that we can build on top of those findings, of those technical fundamentals, but there are new elements necessary, and that is something that we call Open RAN Wave 2, and this is what we are focused on. So first of all, the next level of software disaggregation is a must. Deployments could be possible to be made anywhere on as-is resources, not on the dedicated resources. Right now, you are building computing resources for the networks. The second point is that ultra-dense networking should be really taken into account. So really a high number of radio units, remote radio heads will have to be handled. And last but not least, that's the issue of security that I hope I'll have a chance to talk a little bit more as well. So that's the view.
Excellent. Yes, we will talk about security a little bit later when we hit the challenges section. So I think one of the things that's important in the comments you just gave us is understanding this not as are you there or not there, but in terms of waves and where we sit. And we very much are in this wave 1 ecosystem, but there's still a lot of progress to be made in terms of the maturity and also pushing forward the 5G conversation in the Open RAN space. I want to turn now to Franz, who occupies a very different space in this ecosystem as an operator, and one that has joined forces with Vodafone, Orange, and Telefonica to support the rollout of Open RAN in and across Europe's networks. Can you give us a sense of where we sit in terms of deployment, not just from the vendor perspectives we've just heard, but as an operator needing to do this in practice?
Yeah, sure. My pleasure to be here. So actually it is a fifth one, is part of that as well, as Telecom Italia. And the mere fact that we managed to come up with this famous MOU in January timeframe this year already was strong signal, because when we started talking about that one between these operators a bit earlier, we relatively quickly figured out that we're all in the same boat, that we all share the same needs, and we all said we want to do something to send a very clear signal to the industry, and do it a bit different to how it has been done for some time before. And then someone came up, hey, the last time we really moved the needle, probably that was when this famous this GSM MOU in the 80s was done. So this inspired the whole work behind that one. Shouldn't we do something much more than just saying we want to do something, because we have a certain history that operators come up with requirements but then don't implement. So we said, okay, but then we take it serious. We put it on the top level, so our C levels go into it, and each of us strongly committed to drive the deployment of the technology. So it's not only having a joint set of requirements, but there is each of us really committed. We drive the deployment of the technology to really send a very strong signal to the market, because first of all, you need to show there is a market developing, to make companies like the ones are represented here to really say, okay, it makes sense to invest, to develop products, because the market is coming up. Quite a lot has happened since then, and in the meantime, we also came up with a common set of very detailed requirements, again, giving guidance to the industry. What are the most urgent things we need to see developed? And in parallel, each of us, as said individually, is driving deployment, following slightly different approaches from peers and us. And we have set something up which we called Oran Town. So our approach is that we selected one town in Germany, not too far away from the capital, where we said, okay, we start to build the technology there and start using it under real network conditions. So it's not a completely isolated field trial. We want to integrate into our network. We want to see how it behaves. We want to go through all the pain and see how it works. We want to expose our own people, and we will come a little bit later to that topic, to the new technology, because we know we need to do something on the skill side. We know we need to develop, we need to adapt processes. And the approach is to simply deploy that. Of course, it's an early version, so it would be called Oran Wave 1, so to say, at this point in time, because you need to take what is available on the market right now and not what comes in the next 6 to 12 months, which we did, and we went through all the pain and all the learning. So we gained a lot of understanding here, and we also see how things are developing. So there are a couple of very positive signs we have seen throughout the journey. New products coming in, new companies, new claims, understanding what are the pain points they need to work on, giving us a hint about the solutions, not available yet, but available in the foreseeable futures, and same happening with our friends from the other operators. So I think overall, we really have been pretty successful in developing momentum and drive this thing forward. Are we ready for large scale brownfield deployment, how I explained before, as of today? Probably not yet full scale. That's the slight difference between brownfield and greenfield. Our environment is simply so much more complicated. If you look at the existing networks, the benchmark, because of course we have been very clear from the beginning, yes, we are keen to introduce, but this must not mean we compromise what we offer to our customer. This is of course a complete no-go. So from customer perspective, there is only one way. Experience gets better, service gets better. You cannot tell your customer, you know what, I have the most modern technology. Unfortunately, it's a bit worse than what we have seen before. This of course is not an option. So, and that's exactly the challenge. And as you said, we come to that, how to master these kind of topics. That's what we try to understand, how this can be made a reality, and how can we do it in a way that we can start early and still deliver on the customer side from day one.
So a throwback to the 80s, which is always enjoyable, and the importance of these kind of big European telecom operators, not only saying that this is a priority, but then acting on that priority and doing that collaboratively. And I think your points about, and sort of pulling off of Stein's earlier comments, your points about when we think about deployment, we can't measure this as either or, but we also need to understand that this looks very different in practice depending on the existing ecosystem. And these brownfield deployments look very different than greenfield deployments. And we'll get into some of that, I think, in the challenges as we move forward. Another point I want to kind of foot stomp as we move into our last panelist comments is the importance of demonstrating a market. You can have as many vendors as you like and sort of technological evolutions as you like, but operators and then ultimately customers have to be willing to leverage that technology in practice in real time in the kind of ecosystems that they have. I want to turn now to Sami, who has been waiting patiently as we've sort of walked through this ecosystem. You have a very diverse set of experiences when it comes to 5G and also Open RAN. And so I'm going to ask you to give your thoughts both on sort of the pacing and timing of development to date, but also to sort of pull us up a little bit and give us a sense of what you think the pace and timing might be as we move forward. So put a little bit of your kind of futuristic glasses on and give us a sense not only of where we've been, but where you think we might be going.
Yes, thank you, Melissa. The first thing we have to recognize that Open RAN, to put an Open RAN solution, the operators have to select the different elements and really drive the integration of these elements to meet their expectations. And then, unfortunately, we are not yet in a time where we can do a plug and play, and hence the validation of the solution that every operator has to go through requires intensive work, and hence the need for a system integrator to do that. So, and then it's really, if you look at, and I agree with everything Stein said, and he gave a very good perspective around the overall deployment. One thing that we have to keep in mind is that every operator has a different characteristics that they have to deal with. Some of them on a lower scale, some of them on a very high scale. So hence is really, I would see that, yes, the first adopters of Open RAN solutions are the greenfield. And the greenfield is already, if you say the deployment is already started, and, you know, it's even, you know, Rakuten is getting ready to prime time very soon. So nonetheless, they had to manage significantly the, you know, the challenges that faced not only from the technology, but the challenges in defining a new operating model by which managing, you know, an Open RAN networks. Now, as it relates to, you know, after the greenfield operators is really, I would see that the private networks and enterprise networks, so these are very controlled environments based on which really you can deploy more easily an Open RAN solutions. And it specifically from how you do the orchestration and how you drive new capabilities in top of, you know, this overall mobile network in a very controlled environment. I would say enterprises, this is really, it's a one element, but the private networks as well, like neutral host operators, they are very controlled, very sizable, and you can deal with these kind of deployment more easily. As it relates to, you know, the wider scale deployment, specifically in the brownfield, the brownfield deployment, in my view, you know, will take a bit of time. The difficulty that the operators are facing, it's not in the viability of the technology. I believe this is milestone. This milestone is already achieved. Many of the operators, they did some sort of, you know, Open RAN validation in the lab. Some of them already started into what we call, you know, into field trials. We start with usually the sequence of deployment of any operators. You have the technology trials, lab trials, field trials, and the wide scale deployment. And then you can see is some of them, they started to go at a bit, I would say, not a big deployment. Some of them, they are using 35 sites like Vodafone, but now with Telefonica, they are going to do 1,000 sites network in Germany. So having said that, this really, you can see started really, it's, you know, to take shape. But the notion of really the size of 1,000 sites is needed. It's not only for the validation, how the technology work in a larger scale, but how you define an operating model and in managing such a network. And this is really extremely critical element. So hence, when you look at these really, these imperatives, the deployment, I would say, will start to happen in islands. In islands, in the sense is, as a friend mentioned, will be a small city. And then in other instances, whatever Telefonica is doing in Germany with 1,000 sites. And then I would see it in the less critical part of the network, which is tend to be urban and suburban, because urban and suburban, because where you have, rural and suburban, because really where you have lesser number of connections in the network, is a more, it's the sites that control fewer elements, and hence a less complexity by which you can manage better the situations as well as a risk in order to refine your the operating model. Hence, I would see it, and then as this is demonstrated at scale in a less risky deployment, this really where the time will come to start to deploy it at scale. And what I mean at scale, like I give you an example, AT&T, they have 180 million connections. If you look at Verizon, it's a similar number. And then if you want to deploy a network like this in Frankfurt or London or New York or Toronto, or San Francisco, this is very complex networks. And hence is really to drive the appropriate capabilities on the network. I don't want to only put on the RAN, and a drive to implement these solutions for these networks to be self-healing, to be self-optimizing, to be, driving all the capabilities that the promise of really Open RAN will bring. It's a very high, high level of complexity that has to be addressed. So having said that, if I want to put it, it's really in the green field. I would see this is already happening. Then is really this is really one on the private / enterprise and rural suburban. I would see it within the next couple of years, and then in 2023, 24 is really started to get closer to more island deployment in the control networks. And hence this really, and then depending on the investment level, the operators, they are looking and the space by which they can evolve their operating model and the capabilities needed, this is only will be accelerated. So this is how I see it, Melissa.
That's very helpful, Sami. I think one of the things that all of our speakers have sort of pulled together is to understand this as a spectrum, that deployment will look different given different ecosystems that you are deploying in. You'll likely to see these islands. There'll be different waves of deployment, both in terms of the technical and the maturity capabilities in play. And on top of that, Sami, I think you make a very important point, which is that this is not just about technology. There is this operating model, operators model at play here as well. And then giving us a sense of the scale. 1,000 sounds really large. And then when we start talking about millions, that's a very different conversation. Going back to the point Franz made, which is that customers don't want to just know the technology is better. They don't want their service interrupted, and they want their service quality to stay the same or get better as well. And so needing to address some of those very real practicalities when you're deploying upon an existing network. I want to pivot us at this point because I think all four of our speakers have hinted and poked at some of these questions that come up around challenges or limitations. And there are many of these that come up in this space. We know that there exist on both a technology level, a policy level, operating model levels. There's a lot of interest, and we've heard a lot of interest and a lot of progress that's been made, but there's also some hesitance and some critique, some concerns around Open RAN. Just one example of this is a recent global survey by Mobile World Live, and they found that while 40% of their 370 respondents said they'd plan to deploy Open RAN in the next 12 months to 2 years, so a year to 2 years, another 40% said they have no plans to deploy the technology. And when you limit that sample size to just looking at network operators, that number drops significantly from that 40%. And we get only 20%, 27% of network operator respondents saying they plan to implement Open RAN solutions, so 27% globally. Of course, there's a variety of challenges that surface here, some of which is some uncertainty and trying to gather better information. But there's also a series of concerns that range from readiness for large-scale deployments to complex tasks to the complexity, to the systems integration problem, to incumbent inertia, and to security considerations. Considering just the sheer scope and scale of the topics we want to cover here, I'm going to break it up and ask each of you to reflect on a different area of concern or a different limitation so that we can cover as much ground there as possible. I want to start us off with Slawomir, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about maturity, which is something you've referenced and Sami has referenced, all of the speakers have actually referenced. This is a category of concern where operators are a little bit worried to kind of integrate or build off of a new system, specifically when they have vertically integrated vendors already in place that have built out their previous networks. And it's understandable why many network operators may be concerned about taking a risk here or making the wrong decision. As a vendor in this space, can you walk us through this concern and specifically what steps you've taken at IS Wireless to develop a robust system that's ready for both small and large scale deployments going forward?
Thank you. Let me maybe first refer to these hesitations that some people show. Do you remember, I think many of us remember the prediction that McKinsey gave for AT&T in the early 80s on the mobile phone market. They predicted there will be fewer than fewer than million mobile phones by the year 2000. In fact, in the year 2000, there were 100 million mobile phones. So the prediction really missed the point by a lot, by a factor of a lot. And that the reason for that was that this prediction was based on linear thinking, while what we actually observed was the exponential growth of and the change of paradigm. And I do believe that we have something like that right now with Open RAN, because it really unleashes the creativity of people, the bottom-up creativity. It's not really made top-down. Now, getting to our initiatives and our viewpoint on readiness and the large scale of deployment, this really points to how we foresee the future and how we foresee the situation when this deployment will take place, which for our company is not now. We are targeting a market from around 2 years from now. So we are right now in the process of trialing and proof of concept delivery. But the actual market needs, they will pop up very soon. And that's what we call this Open RAN Wave 2. And there are 3 points, 3 elements. The first one being the last one I mentioned, that's the security and really addressing the security point. The second one is densification, ultra densification of the network. So a situation where macro networks will not be able to provide the actual capacity expressed per area, per square meter, that we so obviously have seen that issue in the COVID domain where many people were using the same resources. So at the end of the day, the throughputs that we were achieving were very low. That's an obvious thing. And last but not least, the further level of disaggregation of the solutions. So I would say software granularity, which should allow to deploy networks on any type of as-is resources and any topologies, to support any topologies. Because right now we have a luxury of, and operators have the luxury still of building the infrastructure that is dedicated for the telecom solutions. But very soon we will share this infrastructure to much larger extent than we are doing this right now. And the multitude of situations in the networks is really high about availability of front haul links and their quality, and also the capacity of computing resources. So just a few words about the security issue, because that sounds to be very important. Many people say that the black box approach is the best security of all, but we don't agree with that. We think that security but by obscurity doesn't really work, and that openness is the natural way forward. Though openness means that there will be more interfaces, there are more interconnecting points exposed to the external world, and that should be, we should take care of that. Now, standards they define their security mechanisms. We have 3GPP that defines end-to-end UE core network security, also within RAN security. We have ETSI that defines virtualized functions security and puts them horizontally in a chain that can be orchestrated by orchestrators. And we have some work on security in O-RAN Alliance. Now, we take all those aspects together in the design of our networks. And additionally, there is horizontal security that needs to be taken care of, which means that the VNF of one vendor needs to work with a middleware of, let's say, be it VMware or Red Hat or Canonical or any other middleware. And then that all should work on either dedicated server or a virtualized machine or on shared resources. Now, this vertical multi-vendor security is handled within a project that we are realizing at ISYLS together with the National Institute of Telecommunications in Warsaw and Warsaw University of Technology. And our ambition is to make, of course, use of that in our design of the solution, but also to work out methods for certifying secure inter-vendor interoperable vendors solutions, and hopefully we could push it also to the standards. So that's a very concrete example of how we collaborate with other partners to work out on the security issue, which is of course very important in current world.
Thank you. I'm actually going to jump at this point to you, Stein, because I think that Slawomir has invoked the security conversation and really helped us to understand that that is part of the broader maturity conversation as well. So security concerns have been a vibrant part of both 5G and Open RAN conversations. It's important to recognize that those security concerns fall into two broad buckets largely, and only one of those is really focused on Chinese companies, which tends to take up the most space in the room, the most air in the room. The first of those concerns are risk-shaped or amplified by the specific actors developing, deploying, and maintaining 5G networks in practice. This is where concerns over Chinese companies largely reside. But the second of those concerns, which I think Slawomir has obviously talked us through in good detail as well, are risks that are intrinsic to 5G networks, whether those are endpoints, IoT, interoperability questions, and those are present regardless of the vendors or operators in practice. And there's numerous concerns there, cybersecurity challenges, for example, that are kind of baked in to 5G networks. Many have touted Open RAN as a solution to both sets of those security concerns, either through greater diversity of vendors, that kind of breaking up that monoculture of vendors, providing alternatives largely to Chinese vendors as well, but also increasing visibility into the network with a greater number of players. More eyes are better than fewer eyes, types of arguments there. But others have also pushed back saying, you know, these networks are not necessarily more secure than their proprietary counterpoints. So our critics are really pointing to the fact that Chinese companies are present in these consortiums, such as O-RAN Alliance, and they're also kind of pointing to this interoperability question. Mixing and matching hardware and software could introduce new opportunities for vulnerabilities and unanticipated failures. So I want to turn to you, Stein, at this point, and can you walk us through, building off of the answer we've just gotten from Slawomir, some of that security debate, and from your perspective, how a multi-vendor ecosystem stacks up against these integrated black box proprietary architectures in terms of security?
Yeah, a good analogy I like to use to try and understand a bit the shift we're talking about is the shift in the mid-80s from integrated computers to disaggregated computers. Up to the mid-80s, the dominated model in the industry was to have one vendor that supplied everything. IBM supplied the chip, supplied the operating system, supplied a lot of the applications, supplied the box, supplied the keyboard, supplied display, supplied the memory. If you needed more memory or more hard drive or even a replacement keyboard, you couldn't go and buy a DEC keyboard and plug it on a Bull keyboard. You had to go and buy the same one, right? Now, they didn't necessarily make all the parts themselves. They sourced them from vendors. They spray painted them with the IBM color and they stuck the IBM logo on it. And they were designed just proprietary, just for them, right? So you couldn't use it on any other device. Same thing with HP, with Sun, with with all the other vendors, which DEC, with Wang, and so on, right? And that was done for many decades because performance requirements, because the industry was getting built, and also one of the big arguments was security. It's going to be very unsecure if you've got multiple vendors supplying different parts. Fast forward just 20 years later, all our computers today are multi-sourced, right? These clouds that we rely on, these data centers for mission critical applications such as hospitals, such as defense systems, such as the stock market, such as companies, such as this conference call, Zoom, operate on components that come from all kinds of places, countries, including China, right? Including any other place. Just like Slamaway said, there was this myth that actually closed black boxes, so obscure systems were more secure, right? And there was always this big debate in the security world. Is it better to have it closed or open? And now it's been shown multiple times over the last several decades by experts, by academics, but also on the field that it is more secure to have an open system. And it's more secure for several reasons. One is that you've got specialization, right? So in the computer world, one company specializes, well, several of them, but a company sells the memory. Another company sells the hard drive, another company. So if you've got a big failure in one of these companies, it's limited to that particular area. And you've got multiple alternatives to source you from. So the component security enables the problem to typically be more limited, and also the vendors look out for each other. So they're very, very eager to point out that someone else is not implementing secure practices or not implementing the interface, right? So there's now, instead of relying on one company that says, hey, don't worry, it's secure, no worries at all. You've got multiple smaller companies, not smaller, but multiple companies selling the various components, and they make sure that the whole system and any one of them will blow a whistle if there's a problem. The second thing is you now have got secure supply chain, because instead of being reliant on one vendor supplying your component, right, you got multiple vendors supplying your components. So if you run out of, I don't know, if simply a piece of software and that vendor, there's a problem with that vendor, either because, I don't know, a geopolitical box, or because that company, there was some crisis unforeseen in the company, or their product is actually defective, you just switch vendors. Does it require some work to reintegrate the new vendor or other? You can pre-do that in advance. So the supply chain diversity, it creates much more resilience. And I think this is an argument that probably didn't resonate much before COVID, but now we've seen COVID, and some auto manufacturers, for example, have relied on one chip alone, versus others like Tesla who've actually done this multi-sourcing supply. We've seen really the difference in the impact and the unforeseen type of supply chain disruptions that can occur from one particular region in the country, of the world, or one particular country, or one area. The third reason why it's more secure is that when you've got a system that's open and interoperates with known standards, standardized, commonly used protocols, you can leverage the tremendous investment that's been done in the IT world for security. And we've got a very fierce competitive environment where we have very innovative companies in the IT world who are developing more and more advanced security software and technologies that are based on artificial intelligence. And they not only look for an attack just the traditional way, so like someone coming in from the outside, but they actually look at the behavior of your system. And from that, they use artificial intelligence to try and determine, is something fishy happening on there? Extremely advanced. And Open RAN can benefit from that. Now, a couple more things to point out. Some people think Open RAN is brand new. It's never existed before. Qualcomm's been supplying Open RAN components for 10 years now. We started in 2011. It wasn't called Open RAN, right? We were supplying small shell chips, and we were pushing that model. Here's a chip. We will not make a small cell device. We're not going to compete with you. We're going to supply that component and enable you to try and do that. And now we're making larger cells. So this is something that's been around for a while. The networks that are deployed today, like the Rakuten network, has got over 10,000 cell sites, macro cell sites, and thousands of small cell sites also. It's got millions of users also on it. So yes, there's work to be done, but it's not like it just appeared out of nowhere and it's completely brand new. The bigger difficulty is that it's a transition, just like Sami pointed out, and Franz also. It's a transition that's difficult for existing players because they've got already a lot to manage, and they have to figure out how you work with this new model where you actually supply. So think about a bank that just used to call up IBM and say, "I want a computer. Just I don't know anything. I don't need to know anything about it. You take care of everything," right? That's always been the model. And now suddenly the bank actually needs to buy a computer system now today. Well, what's happened at the Wilson Center, at other places, is now those kind of organizations like a bank or anything have got an IT department, and the IT department actually either themselves or it's an outsourced IT department that actually knows how to pick among, well, should I get a Cisco router? Or should I get a Juniper component? Or should I get this? What Wi-Fi router should I get? And how do I make sure that they all work together? And how do I actually call up the vendors if there is a problem, right? If they don't want to work together.
Thank you. I think so. Obviously, a big shout out to every IT department everywhere that is always overworked and understaffed. So a big shout out to them. I think a couple of the things that you point to, which are, I think, important for us to remember, is these practices have long existed. It's the naming that has changed. So when we talk about their kind of ecosystems, their maturity, the longevity, where we stand, it's important to not just start with the Open RAN branding that sort of started to hit there, to talk about that broader process. And then also widening the security aperture when we talk about security, from kind of incentives in industry and the ways in which industry compete in ways that can be beneficial for security, avoiding vendor lock-in, being able to allow security to be a competitive advantage where you can choose companies based on sort of their security profile, and then also the supply chain components of that and the ability to have resilience as part of that security conversation. I want to take a term that you used quite a bit there, this interoperability, right, aggregating across a variety of different vendors, and turn to you, Franz. One of the other areas that there's been a lot of concern around or conversation around is this integration question, that being able to choose in practice between a variety of vendors, to be able to switch in practice if you feel that a vendor perhaps is not as secure as you had hoped they would be, but needing to integrate and transition in practice from a single vendor to a multi-vendor ecosystem. So many critics of Open RAN have pointed to particularly rural or smaller carriers as uniquely poorly situated to juggle a diversity of vendors, that it's easier for them to stick to proprietary solutions because of this integration question in practice. And there's concerns around plug and play. You sit today in an operator that is actively pursuing these options. Can you talk about your experience with systems integration in practice and the steps you are taking at Deutsche Telekom to ensure the various components of the RAN, both the hardware and software, which we've heard conversations about that disaggregation there, are interoperable in practice and not just in theory?
Yeah, sure. And let me actually start a little bit with quickly reflecting on the numbers you mentioned in the very beginning. Actually, I think if you remember correctly, you said 27% of all operators are committed to implement Open RAN in the next 2 years, which I feel, looking at the still early days of the technology where we are, knowing it's not proven in many networks deployed in tens of thousands of sites, is quite a strong commitment, especially if you look at it also saying this Open RAN is not a one-to-one replacement to the existing solution, but it implies you do things differently, especially because of the integration challenge you mentioned. Of course, you can take a very simple stake saying, okay, now is this Open RAN is out there, fine, I can't do it, so I'm going to one of the usual suspects we call system integrator or solution provider and let them do it for me. And they will happily do so. I tell you, I know they are investing heavily into that area of technology and they will happily take the role. You just need to ask yourself, is this the role I want to be as a telco, being then not dependent on the Ericssons and Nokias and the likes, but then being dependent on whomever system integrator you chose. You can, of course, do so. We look at it a little bit different because we believe, and one of the targets we follow with Open RAN is we want to get more control back to ourselves. So we don't want to be fully depending on the roadmap and the development speed of these big guys. They delivered, no discussion. Of course, they build excellent technology, but we are one, even though we are one of the bigger ones, and also looking at our peers in US, We are big customers, but still we are one of many. And they always need to prioritize the development roadmaps. What do they do? What do they not do? What makes sense economically for them? So you're always one of many, and you always have a hard fight. Do you get what you want? But on the other side, in our market, we want to differentiate. We want to provide a better service to our customer, where we are limited because we don't get certain things at the point in time we would like to have from our suppliers. And that's one of the big bets and beliefs, and we are pretty sure this is going to happen. If we take more of the integration responsibility ourselves, of course we can steer what we integrate. If we work with smaller companies, certain features may not make sense for a big player. A smaller company may be perfectly happy in doing that because it's a fundamentally different market, completely different calculation on their side, and they will be happy to work with us in developing them. All that implies, of course, and now coming to your question, things work between each other. Now, what we are doing now, still in the early days, very often, and we saw that over the last year, that certain components came together more or less almost the first time in their life in our labs, or before in the labs of the suppliers we are working with, but they have never worked before. So you go, of course, through all the pains of getting things integrated. Yes, there are standards, but standards still leave you options. They are interpreted slightly differently, and you only see it once you bring the things together, and you go through all the pain. That's the usual thing you need to do if you're an early mover. Is that a sustainable long-term approach? Yeah, of course not. We very much believe and drive to make the ecosystem and the community able to do this kind of interop testing between themselves. And we have these things in place today. It happens between the existing suppliers, and it happens to a large extent between devices and networks. The only reason why you can buy a device in the shop, switch it on, whatever network you are, and it works, because there's a lot of testing happening up front. It's called certification, and that's this, well, it's not a secret sauce, but that's the key enabler to make that happen. And we foresee something very similar for O-RAN components. So the O-RAN Alliance has next to it a testing entity. It's called OTIC. We also have things like the TIP group working, and they're all here to make things working together. And what we envision, and not only us, but the whole O-RAN Alliance, is really a kind of certification scheme. So suppliers go there with their piece of software most of the time. They test it between each other, and then they get a certificate. So if I'm, as an operator, buying a piece of software that has that certificate, I know it works in principle. It may not be fully optimized to my specific deployment model. So I always say roughly it works on 80% level. And the thing I have to do, and don't underestimate, I still need to work in my lab to get the last 20% done, to really get optimum performance, everything tweaked to my specific deployment situation, to get it going like one. But it sounds a bit misleading here. I need to fine tune the last 20%, but I don't need to go through all the pain to make the things working in principle and finding all these odd things. That's happening to a large extent upfront in the community. And that's why we believe if we take that on, that's a complexity we are able to manage, because things are already working. Of course, on top comes then also massive changes we are driving here regarding automation. So working on fully automated test environments, automated deployment, so having much less manual work, so it's not hitting back on us badly on workforce. Because of course I also cannot say, I'm doing that. Unfortunately, that leads I need to quadruple or increase 10 times my radio teams. That again would be a killing argument. But bringing all these state-of-the-art technologies, bringing all this software, which we know from other areas of the industry, the challenge is to bring them to the radio and the specifics of the radio. So radio is, to some extent, special. First of all, the algorithms are extremely complex, and Slavo can tell that 100 times better than I do. The computer need to do how complex the algorithms are, but it's doable. Yeah, and the second aspect, of course, the sheer amount of sites. So it's an extremely distributed system we have not seen before in that case. And here still a lot of additional development is required to manage that in a highly automated manner. But we see a lot of progress. But the secret sauce is really let the community do a lot between them and apply state-of-the-art automated technologies to make the things easier from the deployment perspective. So in the end, move the radio much more to a software-centric model of operation. Of course, there is still a lot of hardware required that has to stay. Radio units, antennas, This cannot be easily virtualized up to now, as far as I know, but all the rest of the software piece that really goes down then that route, and by that makes the challenge manageable. Also for smaller players, and if not, as said, plan B, there will be more than sufficient system integrators out there happy to help wherever you want them. You are on mute.
Thank you. Yes, I pushed it a bit early and then remuted myself. I think you pull a couple of different components of that together that are really helpful for us, both in terms of understanding what the interoperability problem actually is in practice, and who's best equipped to solve those problems in practice and when, both in terms of thinking about the role of these integrators as sort of independent companies that can come in and assist, but also companies like yours that can integrate in-house and even offer some of those insights on to others. And then of course, the importance of certification, the not so secret sauce, and sort of thinking about interoperability in practice. And recognizing that this is not going to be a painless process, that early movers usually face more friction than later movers, but that doesn't make it an unworthwhile or an unmanageable process. I want to turn to you, Sami, at this point to talk about a final category of concern here. It kind of has two parts to it. It's really stemming around incumbents and thinking about their place in the ecosystem. Where does a company like your former company, Nokia, fit into this Open RAN conversation? Where do they sit in this ecosystem? And then similarly, as you're looking at operators trying to make this transition, that are looking at brownfield deployments, what are some of the lessons or advice you would give them so that they're in a good position in that 2 to 3 year window that Slawomir is talking about to be able to capitalize on this technology? Oh, Sami, you're also on mute. We're on a mute streak at this
I'm
point.
sorry. So first, really, we have to recognize that Open RAN is at the end is a mean to an end. It's not the end itself. If you look, the operators, they are looking to build, it's really new network that will be completely virtualized, eventually will be cloud native, that gives them the flexibility, to give them the agility to develop a new feature functionality, give them the platform for innovation to bring any capability available in the network, available in the industry, to augment their network, give them the ability to define a new operating model to manage this network as is becoming an IT network, leveraging all the technologies and the know-how that was developed in IT network in this particular area of the network, with the promise that all this will lead to eventually lower TCO and a better ROI. And this is really the fundamental premise that we are looking after. Certainly, the RAN is a significant part of this component now. And this really is a significant part because when you look at mobile networks, almost 60–70% of the cost are in the RAN. Yeah. So having said that, if really the first thing is as it relates to the role of the incumbents, in my view, is really we needed to recognize the incumbents. They have a significant capability, significant knowledge that we need to continue to leverage. But however, we needed to leverage all this knowledge within the new construct that I'm talking about, because we needed to recognize the incumbent, they cannot deliver anymore everything that is required to build a cloud native, end-to-end mobile network capabilities going forward while maintaining very high speed and a pace of innovation. We can debate, that they can do that, but at the same time, we need to recognize that the pace by which innovation can be brought is completely different going forward from the past. And hence is really that, I would see them, it's essential for them to be at the table to help in the transition, because really specifically, you cannot build tomorrow take AT&T network or Deutsche Telekom network and say a flip like this. Oh, I have now an Open RAN network, serving 180 million connection in AT&T. You see, it takes time. The transition, hence really that we need them at the table. So having said that, but building this notion of a flexibility has to be the first element for the operator to be instituted in the mode of operations. How you can start to set up yourself, as really Franz mentioned, to bring all these new players, to create an environment to test these new capabilities. Who is the system integrator? Do you want to build yourself the integration capability? All this really has to be defined in order to facilitate. This is really, it's the interworking of the new players, and then really with the incumbents in order to facilitate the transition. So having said that, this really, I would say, is a fundamental. But if you step back and then to your second part of the question, I would see that the operators, I have no doubt, they have to accelerate the virtualization of the mobile networks, because this is really foundational to create this network that we are needed to deliver on the promises that I outlined. This is the first thing, and this acceleration is really it will dictate with it the need to change the operating model, and then start to evolve the back office environment, the bringing in new capabilities, evolving the mode of operations toward the more an IT-like mode of operations, and all this kind of things is really that are essential. So first is really acceleration of the virtualization of the network. Two is really acceleration, in the evolution of the operating model towards a more cloud-based operating model. Three, creating an environment by which is really you can stress the innovation by institutionalization. This is really, it's a validation of the innovation in the operator side, and leveraging a wide area of ecosystem players by which they can work together to make the solution together. And the fourth is really to start to invest, because don't forget, I do not believe that the initial deployment of Open RAN will be cheaper than the current. This will be significantly, there will be significant more investment needed, specifically in the brownfield, in order to get ready the deployment of Open RAN at a larger scale. So the investment is really is extremely important. And last is building the capability, because the capability is really, it's as you know, it's with all due respect, that we need a new set of capabilities. Many of the operators they do not have at this point in time, and specifically as we want to evolve the network from what I call the traditional, monolithic network to an IT cloud-based network. So these new set of capabilities are absolutely required. All these has to come together in order to transition from where they are today to where the network needs to be. And don't underestimate this, really, it's these elements, because in the operators, and then these are tall order elements that will take significant efforts, significant change in culture, significant change in really how they operate, and hence this transition really has to take multiple steps with additional cost.
The importance of thinking through that transition and the role of the operator in particular in shaping that transition. And I think your call here, which is an important one, is Open RAN is sort of not existing as a complete alternative to these existing incumbents. They will be important both in the transition, but in those sort of future ecosystems to come. They're sort of sometimes put up as either you choose the future of these companies or you choose Open RAN, and never the two shall meet. So I think offering that framing. Something that's come up over the previous hour that I want to briefly touch on. I have two questions to hit. Hopefully in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to rush you a little bit here so we can get into Q&A. One of these topics is standards. And this is something that I think we've all touched on to a varying degree. It seems like you can't really have a full conversation about 5G or Open RAN without at least touching on standards, the standards process itself and the outcomes of that process. And whether this is accurate or not, there is a growing perception on both sides of the Atlantic that potentially the US and Europe are not taking standards bodies and that process as seriously enough as they should. or at the very least are maybe not taking seriously enough how different China's approach is to these bodies and these processes. So is that an accurate assessment? And to what extent is this conversation around standards also primarily a conversation around China? So I'm going to start with the two equipment vendors in the room. Stein, will you offer a first answer here about kind of standards bodies? And then I will turn to you, Swalamir. And then if there's something brief you want to add on, Sami or Franz, we'll turn to you as well.
So I'm not really aware of any particular problems in standards, honestly. I've been in standards for many, many years in the past, and I still follow standards nowadays. Typically, standards work well. I mean, it's a technical focused, consensus-based. Yeah, occasionally we have to change how things are done, the processes, or there's the O-RAN alliance had a little bit of a snafu there because the US was actually blocking some players from the participation of some entities in China created some issues, but we just solve it and we work at it. From my perspective, I think the worst thing that could happen is that technical standards, which are based on technical merit, start getting politicized and governments start getting involved in them. So I think right now the way they work is working fine. Now, as to the question of need of standards and all that, standards help facilitate interoperability, right, and help things work more smoothly. And France is pointing a hopeful future where things will just, one vendor buys a piece of software from one place and a piece of hardware from another piece of software, and you just put them together and it works magically. That's a great future, and that would be really desirable. It doesn't mean that meanwhile you should wait till that future happens. We've been involved in dozens and dozens and dozens of deployments, helping Colin with our expert team. From same vendors, right? Everything Ericsson, or everything Nokia, or everything Huawei. There all is tons of problems. There are always issues with interoperability, with making things work within their own equipment, because it's different teams from the same company that's actually working on different parts. There are always misunderstanding of how the standard was written, even though 3GPP standards are very thoroughly written. And then there's the problem of making them work with handset devices. So we're not going to get, we're not in a world today where you just order the equipment and it gets deployed and everything works perfectly. That's not at all the case. There's a lot of work to make it actually work within the same vendor's equipment, with the various vendors in the infrastructure, and then with the various handsets. We're also not in a world where you have to wait to start deploying Open RAN. You've seen Rakuten, you've seen others, you've seen Dish. They're going ahead. You've seen Telefonica. They're not saying we're going to wait for some new version of standard. There are plenty of standards that dictate how the various elements work between the internet standards, the 3GPP standards, the O-RAN standards. Can you make more standards and specify things even further? Yeah, it's good. But sometimes you can also over-specify things, and that's not a good thing either. So we've certainly seen some efforts where in the past, historically, where people have said, well, let's do nothing till the standard is done. And like in multimedia, in IMS, in the network, this was trying to use internet on the network, cell phone networks. The standard took 10 years. And in the end, when it was finished, it was so thick, no one could implement it because it was just too complicated. I mean, I don't know anybody who actually understood that document. It was just so thick and full of contradictories. So standards are often used in the Open RAN context as an excuse to delay and not to go ahead. More standards will help as the standards continue to develop, yes, but it shouldn't be used as a reason to not go ahead. You're muted.
There we go. Don't use standards as a reason not to go ahead. It's sort of the snake eating its own tail to a certain extent, right? Don't deploy until it's fully mature, but if you don't start developing and maturing the product, it will never be deployable. So sort of that kind of component there. I want to turn to you.
Quite right. And by the way, speaking of that, a lot of the standard contributions we make, other companies make, come from the deployments. When we actually start deploying, we realize, oh, actually, you know what? This part of the standard doesn't really make sense, or is not clear, or there's this thing missing. So you can't wait. You have to deploy now, and that'll inform and improve standards. Absolutely, you're completely right, Melissa.
An important point, that iterative process. So everybody who's in the kind of community that's watching this and looking at a lesson learned, there's a really good bumper sticker to take away. Don't wait. These things inform each other. Slawomir, I want to turn to you here briefly if you have a couple comments to add to that around standards.
Sure. Well, obviously there should be a balance in standardizing granularity, as Stein indicated. But I would like to point to the beginnings of 3GPP. That's the key standard for our mobile industry. So at the very beginning, the reason for forming this standard was very much in line with what we are talking about right now. So opening up the monolithical solutions, so defining interfaces and lowering the entrance barrier for new players, allowing segments to specialize and to have a healthy competition within those segments. But these old times are gone. Right now, I have to say strongly that these older standards, such as 3GPP or ATC, are more used by incumbent players to take advantage of for the technical areas. Basically, the patent pulling and pushing their own concepts into the standards is effectively blocking new entrants into this field, and that's an important point. And this thing is very nicely identified in a recent study from the British government in the 5G supply chain diversification strategy. That's a good piece of reading. Now, I think it's not really a China question, as you indicated at the very beginning. It's more what Stein somehow indicated in a previous part of his speech. It's the dependency on a single supplier. If you have a large dependency on a single supplier and undiversified value chain, then you are asking for troubles. You all know and you all remember that Volvo was a Swedish company once. So the companies, they change owners and they can land in hands that are unwanted for our area, for our geographical area. Therefore, the best protection from such situation is to diversify the value chain. And then if we don't like, for any reason, a supplier of part of that, then we can replace it for anything else.
Sami or Franz, do you have something brief to add here? I know we've covered a lot of ground, but I also want to give you a chance to reflect.
Just a very quick one. We should all not forget, we would not be where we are in mobile without standards. The fact that you can travel wherever you want across the whole globe, you turn on your phone and it works, only works because of global standards. And that's pretty unique for mobile communications, by the way. There are not too many industry areas where it works like that. And yes, all true, you can always discuss things have been over standardized. It's also used by some players to protect, all true, and you need to work on that. But the basic, without standards, I'm not sure we would have this session here today if we would not have that. And that is the piece we really should do everything possible to keep. Splitting up standard, I don't know, anyone still remembering 3GPP2? You know, splitting things up doesn't help. It just makes life so much more complicated. We really should do everything possible to make sure we stay on one global standards track as much as possible here.
Yes, I do remember those days where you would travel to Europe and your phone would not work. You would have to get a completely different device. Sami, I want to give you a few minutes here before we move into last question Q&A.
I will start from the end. You know, the way to think about standards of the past, it's not the way for the future. So this really, let us start this really with this fundamental premise. We need absolutely standards, and I agree with the friends and what he said. However, the standards has to be adapted to accelerate the pace of innovation that the new architecture will allow us to drive going forward. Hence, is really, if you are now in a cloud-based environment, you are developing features every hours, every day, and then you see if it takes us a standard 2 years to finish, what the hell this innovation is all for. So hence the pace of innovation will dictate a new approach to the standards. but the standards will be absolutely required in order to ensure a global reach, if you like, and interoperability between networks. So this really, it's a fact. And at this point in time, is, you know, I'm not seeing that enough of the thought process it's out there yet in order to allow us to accelerate the adoption of this new standard mentality. Yeah. So with the ORAN Alliance, yes, we are defining the interfaces to interoperate, but this is only a start. Nonetheless, we need a set of standards to take all this to make it is really to enable a global reach and interworking across the globe.
Perfect. Thank you. So I want to integrate, we're going to pivot our conversation to policy solutions in the transatlantic environment. And this is an area where we actually got a significant number of questions. So I'm going to kind of integrate, weave a couple of those questions in as I hand this question off to the panelists. So we've talked a little bit about similarities between the US and Europe at the start and kind of how they're approaching this issue. What are some of the kind of differences in how we're approaching this issue, the policy areas that you would like to see us develop or use, the things we're already doing that you're saying, please don't discontinue this. It's actually incredibly helpful. If you're going to discontinue something, don't discontinue this. And then we have sort of two questions here that I'd like to weave into this sort of transatlantic. One is from Clifton Burdick, and he wants to know whether our current regulatory system is sufficient for full-scale Open RAN approaches. So he has a very regulatory specific question here. And the other is from Sudhir Iyer, and he wants to know about policies in the EU and specifically what the EU should be doing at an EU-wide level, so not just discrete European countries. So as you're thinking about this sort of transatlantic approach, what you like that we've done, what you hope we do more of, if you could speak a little bit to some EU questions and some regulatory questions. I am going to start with you, Stein, and then we'll head to Sami and then down the line.
So answering a little bit of the differences, I think we've seen both and similarities, both in the United States and in Europe, a strong support for the concept of Open RAN. The European Commission came out with a study on that topic, the United Kingdom. I think among the countries, my perception, and this might be a bit subjective and personal, is that German is the most advanced and from that perspective and that thinking. I'm not going to go too much into the politics and the tools, because I'm not an expert in that area. What I do feel like is Europe needs to do first of all, avoids fragmentation within Europe and the rest of the world. There have been some people who've started saying, well, this is an opportunity to create a nation, like just for our country, and own different technology, on their own different supply chain. I think sovereignty is a good objective, and Open RAN certainly supports this, but sovereignty at the cost of fragmentation and separating away from the other European countries and the rest of the world is definitely a dangerous direction to go in. The second thing is it's important for Europe and for the United States to support the existing suppliers. We need an Ericsson and a Nokia in this transition. Sami pointed out they play an important role. They can play a role as integrated, they can play a role as supplier, they can play multiple roles, but more importantly, we cannot afford to have a gap during this supply where we somehow weaken these strong players because we're talking about critical national infrastructure now. Well, while cell phone systems originally, when they were set up, were a luxury considered just for the rich traveling salesman or the CEO who wanted to call home, or his other CEO, today it's really a lifeline. It's like water and electricity. It's a right for everybody to have and a necessity for everybody to have. So just like France was saying, we need to ensure that the transition is actually smooth. And then finally, the US and Europe need to coordinate efforts forwards and feeding foundational technology. A foundational technology that will enable others, and as well as small players like IS Wireless and others, so we can grow this new crop and ensure that they actually have got a place to live and grow and exist in this new environment.
Sami, would you like to add a little here about sort of transatlantic opportunities?
Yes, first is really, it's what I understand, specifically in the US, the NTIA gotten or up to for a decision to be made with a 1.5 billion to stress, if you like, Open RAN innovation in the US. And in addition with that is really, it's around 500 million that was earmarked for this, the replacement of untrusted networks, if you like, small mobile operators that they cannot afford to do it on their own. So first is really, I would see in Europe, if I look at the similar things happening, yeah, in the UK, small amount was given, 35 million is earmarked to help with the creating and operate, interoperability lab for the UK. And then in Germany, if I'm not mistaken, there is as well, as part of the 2 billion broadband fund, there is around 200 million was defined specifically for 5G, including Open RAN. So having said that, I would see there is enough momentum that started, not enough across, the North America and Europe in this regard. So, but the question is really, what do we do with this money if it's available? In my view, is really that to seed lots of innovation, of incubation, to accelerate the innovation on Open RAN and virtualized, what I call the mobile networks or cloud native mobile networks, by which really that we can accelerate the innovation, pace of innovation on these networks, taking the new architecture, including Open RAN. So this is really one thing where I see that from a policy perspective would be extremely useful between North America and Europe. Two is really accelerating the existence of interoperability centers, because we will need a lot of them. Because if we wanted to start to disaggregate, how we wanted to allow enough of these interoperability centers to exist in order to start, every 3 months you have the new capabilities, you have to test, you have, to try new things in order to allow you to accelerate the innovation cycle. So hence is really the interoperability testing environment and to be created, at enough locations in order to stress this innovation is really would be extremely important. And the three is, in my view, is in some instances, to what extent, like if you look at the RDOF, $42 billion in the US can be earmarked to accelerate the deployment of, Open RAN based architecture in really, as we talked about, in the rural and suburban locations, because there's really, rather than this money to be given to deploy, technologies and architectures of the past, some of it can be earmarked to accelerate the deployment of Open RAN, because we know this is really more controlled environments, less risky environment to operate under, allow us to start to develop really whatever it needed to operate at scale. And this is really another idea that I think will be useful.
Excellent. So briefly, Slawomir, would you like to add on here a little bit of transatlantic cooperation?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think that the role of governments is to protect from oligopolies and monopolies. Now, RAN deployment is geographically large deployment. So if you decide in a single RAN model to deploy a network on a certain area, then the vendor gets a monopoly basically for that area. Therefore, diversification and splitting this value chain is so important, because otherwise you will end up on relying on a single supplier. And that thing is nicely seen in EU's 5G toolbox for security, where it specifies this dependency as a major threat, or one of the major threats for rolling out the 5G networks. And Open RAN has a role to break it up. Now, for the US, I would say that you also need diversity. If you look into the RAN vendors that are US based, then they are very much relying on development centers in other Asian countries, not China, but the other one. And very soon it may happen that this dependency becomes as painful as the Chinese dependency happened. So diversification, not putting all the eggs into one basket, is an important point. Europe has a role here to offer the alternatives, and the European alternatives, they can work both for the EU direction, where we, like Poland, collaborate very strongly in EU funded research and development projects, but also on the direction of Central and Eastern Europe. And there is the 3 Seas region. We can indicate the 3 Seas region there, which has a great role and a possibility to provide the intellectual minds and creativity for building new solutions in this sphere. So I would say that this is also a diversification, but at the level of providing various concepts and putting the whole value chain, making it safe.
I want to end with you, Franz. I apologize for holding you to a tight time limit. We're in the final minutes and we'll be wrapping up very quickly. So we're racing the clock, but what are some of your wish list items around transatlantic cooperation? Oh, you are also muted. We're on a roll with the mute button.
Thank you. Finally, I made it as well. Speaking of it, I was just waiting for that. Sorry. I think a lot has been said already in a couple of good comments. So from my perspective, but that may be because I'm here in Europe and, you know, the grass is always greener at the neighbors. My feeling is US is a bit more clear and more focused on driving ORAN. I still hear more discussion happening in Europe, not being as clear, which has different reasons, and some of them have been mentioned already. Actually, I would really wish to catch up here, because if there is one grain of salt from my perspective in the whole ORAN, it's too little Europe. So IS wireless Slavor is one of the positives, but I would love to see much more of these type of things also happening in Europe, and then working, of course, cross Atlantic and collaborate, and more clarity from policy here in Europe may be helpful to have more of newcomers being courageous and saying, okay, I'm going into it. I'm going to drive that and develop that out of Europe. So to keep also the European, how shall I say, tradition of being really leading in the market of communication technology.
A call for action across Europe, which will speak to that EU question. So in the last couple minutes, this is the rapid fire. It's 30 seconds to 1 minute, and I will hold it to you in an as aggressive as a virtual moderator can be manner. We have covered a lot of ground today, talking about some very technical policy, ranging from the United States to various countries within Europe, across Europe. So to help ground our listeners on the way out the door, I would like each of you in 30 seconds to a minute to offer your sort of one task item. So if you could snap your fingers or wave a magic wand or summon a genie, what would you pick to instantly accomplish as a policy objective? One policy objective, either in the United States, in Europe, or across the transatlantic community. Where should we focus our energy and resources today to best equip us for the future? And I'm going to actually start with you, Franz.
Oh, thank you.
30 seconds to a minute. You're in the hot seat.
Oh my God, that's a difficult one. Yeah, the thing to do is make sure the industry ecosystem is really there to enable newcomers, to enable new companies to come in, to catch up, to be part of the greater piece, and be the part of the puzzle that in the end gives that Open RAN picture, delivering all the things we have been discussing now for the last 1.5 hours.
Excellent. On time and under budget. Stein, what is your wish list item?
Look at cycling, velodrome cycling. They had a similar problem. No one wanted to go ahead. Everybody's waiting. So it was made for a slow race, and it was a terrible race. And they implemented some innovative solutions to try and break that up. One of them is the Cairn, one is the point race concept, where you've got a finish line. and one was a mandate, and you can see which one worked better and how it actually spurred on. And now velodrome racing is extremely exciting to watch.
Excellent. Racing. Sami, what is your wish list item?
I believe the US is making very good progress in providing clarity around the strategic objectives that it's looking to achieve with Open RAN. There is a need for Europe, I agree with France, to have a more clarity and around from the European community itself. This is really about, this is not an option. It's a must in order to accelerate the pace of innovation needed in the industry. This is really one. And the second, I would say that the joint, operating interoperability labs that can be instituted between, Europe and the US, and they provide this as a cross-sharing and breaking the barriers in order to make this innovation fluid. This really will be extremely important policy direction to take.
Some strategic focus. Slawomir, you have the last word in our final 30 seconds.
Thank you. I think that what would need to be done is to spread the word and do more panels and events like this one, because getting into the minds of decision makers, especially for new entrants, is quite difficult. They are flooded by the noise provided by the incumbents for obvious reasons. So I would say getting with the knowledge there and supporting the newcomers. They will bring much more innovations, and the 5G, by the way, can only be made together. So I would say I would end up this with the 5G made together term.
Increasing information and togetherness, a very hopeful,
Exactly.
I think, ending. So we are now at time. I want to extend my immense gratitude to each of the 4 panelists for sharing their insights and their expertise with us. This has been an incredibly informative hour and a half, a real whirlwind of great amount of detail there. I also want to thank our audience for taking the time out of, I'm sure it is a very busy day, to listen in and participate in today's discussion on Open RAN. As Slawomir pointed out, this is an important component of sort of thinking about how we can progress here. And finally, I want to give a shout out to all the teams at STIP and the Polish Embassy who worked tirelessly behind the scenes and without whom this event would not have been possible. We hope to see all of you at future Wilson Center events. And in the meantime, for any lingering 5G questions, head on over to our website, 5g.wilsoncenter.org. It's your one-stop shop for all things 5G. Thank you for joining us.